Doesn't matter where we look.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another special edition of Litter Media Live. I'm Mike Smith, and joining us today we have Brian Grigsby of the Fellowship of Christian Athletes and Tom White of Accurate Heating and Cooling, where we're talking about their Gus Macker tournament that's coming up, and also talking about how faith plays a role in sports, or can at least. Our interview today brought to you by Litter Quality Propane. There's no bill when there's a fill. Contact Litter Quality Propane today about our metered gas service at litterpropane.com. Back with Brian Grigsby and also Tom White. As you can see on the screen there, the deadline to register for this year's Gus Macker, I believe that's coming up on May the 12th.
Yes.
How did you come up with the idea as Fellowship of Christian Athletes been the benefactor for this year's Gus Macker?
Well, to be transparent, through a lot of prayer, we had an opportunity presented to Tom to get involved with Gus Macker. Dr. Gray had brought the tournament back last year and her team, and they were looking to kind of make a transition there. And so they brought it to Tom, who's had a history with Gus Macker, brought it to me about what would it look like for FCA to take this on. And so we prayed through that a lot, and it just seems like, I mean, I could go on for an hour, but the symmetry there, but obviously there's basketball and it's sports, which is the world that we live in with FCA. But then we can also, how do we make this a community event? How can we unite not just us as a ministry, but how can we unite churches? How can we unite the civic, with the city and all that, and then also uniting the churches and the impact that we could have on a community when we do that? It just seemed like a no-brainer for us to take this on. And then, yes, it is a fundraiser as well, which would be a huge blessing. But it's really more than that. It's not really about the fundraising side of it. It's about doing something in the community that brings all these groups together. Basketball and FCA just gets to be the vehicle to do that.
Yeah, I know Gus Macker tournament was so big in the Chillicothe area for 2 or more decades. Yeah. And then it went away for a while. Now, you were probably a kid, Brian, when they were,
yes,
gung-ho. How has it been getting people acclimated to, hey, Gus Macker is still Gus Macker.
Yeah.
It's good about, fellowship and good, clean fun.
Yeah. So we've been very blessed that this community already knows what Gus Macker is. Like the legacy, the foundation that was built back in the 90s specifically has laid a really good foundation. So when we talk about Gus Macker, everybody already has a concept of what it is. We're not trying to, like Tom was doing in the 90s, we're not trying to sell people on this idea of what it could look like to have a 3-on-3 basketball tournament in the streets of Chillicothe. That visual's already there. My generation being the heart of that, because we were the ones playing as kids in that time. And so really what it's been for us has been more of a transition of how do we share with the community of what it looks like for FCA to be the ones that are involved and kind of the leading organizing group for this, rather than trying to sell what it would look like to have a 3-on-3 basketball tournament in the streets. And so that's been a blessing because it's allowed us to share more about FCA and what we do.
Tom, of course, Accurate Heating, Cooling, and Plumbing, of course, the faith-based ownership in your organization and all the things that you try to do in our community, not only for your business, but trying to do it and conveying to the community that businesses can have a faith-centered mission in even what a business does. Talk about how that plays into what Brian's talking about with the Fellowship of Christian Athletes.
So there's several ways, Mike. From a business standpoint, my journey into faith was in my 50s and 60s of age. In reflection, I see God was working in my life. I just didn't know it. And so all of the success of Accurate has been through God. There's no way I could have done this. And the people that he's brought to us, both customers and employees over the years, no question. Now I know it, and now I've come all the way to feeling that, really Accurate is God's company. And I just need to be a good steward, and I need to lead like Jesus leads. And so I'm at a point where I'm transitioning out of the operation, and I call it transitioning because as long as I don't get dementia and I add value to it, I'm going to be there. But Otherwise, I'm turning it over to them, and it's important to me that the faith is embedded in our culture. So that's what I'm working on there. Now I'm going to shift to, you know, Mike, you go back with me, that always sports and education were critical to me. And I had a passion for kids. I served on school boards and so forth because I had this passion. And I'm like, it's not either or. You know, there's life lessons learned in sports that prepare kids for life just like education does. And it's not an either or. So I've always been there on that. And then when I roll this forward, Buzz Knowles, who is Mr. Junior Achievement, he brought Junior Achievement here to Ross County. And I served on his board with him leading it. And they brought Gus Macker concept. At the time, it was the Visitors and Convention Bureau and Barrows, and they brought it back, and they were shopping it through the service organizations. And we met monthly. And they brought it to Buzz. And about the third month of meeting, Buzz said, guys, if we don't grab a hold of this opportunity, we're going to lose it. Somebody else is going to get it. But this would be a great opportunity for us. And he looked right at me in the meeting, and he said, if you'll chair this, we can take it. And I had no choice. So, and we grew it. And to Brian's point earlier, nobody knew what a basketball tournament in the streets meant, so getting sponsors and things like that. But over time, we put people together that just made that work so well, and it was such a great fundraiser for Junior Achievement. Same thing. Okay, now roll this forward. I think over time, I thought it ran its course, but by 2015, now let me say this too, that when Scott started this originally in the late 80s and 90s, it was a 3-on-3 tournament in his driveway in Belding, Michigan, a population of 5,000. And when he started taking that on the road, his vision was that it was going to be in the streets, in these downtowns, in these small communities. And Chillicothe had the premier venue for that. It's in the streets with a park next door, all of that. So Scott has always felt that that Chillicothe was what he wanted. So by 2015, it ran its course, so to speak, and that was the last time they did a Gus Macker. So then I get a call, as Brian just said, Cheryl's House of Hope and Dr. Gray got together, and they said, so they called me last February, and they said, hey, we're bringing Gus Macker back. Would you help us? And I said, guys, if you promise me you can't draw me back into it again to the level I was at before, then I'd be glad to help you in any way. So long story short, and I'll try, I got drawn back into it, into the event. And I saw the energy again and the opportunity, and where I told my wife I was just going down for opening ceremonies and I'll be back in a half hour, and I spent the day, I got drawn in. So then all the time I'm saying, if FCA would take this on, then I will be in. If they won't, so Brian brought it to Brian, and they ran it through FCA, and it was a good fit. So here's what I see, Mike, where sports and education are two legs of the stool. Now, if people have a faith base, if we could get kids, and what FCA is doing and what Brian is doing for Southern Ohio and getting FCA into the schools, now we've got the third leg of the stool. Yeah. Yeah. If you've got a base, in the most critical, if these kids have a faith base, education and sports, they're going to be unstoppable.
Right.
Yeah.
So, Brian, I know you're growing the FCA here in the area. How many schools are you in now?
That's a great question. We have a presence in 14 schools right now in Southern Ohio. That's kind of from Pickaway County down through the river. So, yeah. And
for those that don't know, how does that fit into a school day, or how does that work?
Yeah, so that's one of the things with FCA is we are able to have good structure as far as like we are able to present to that local school, here's what FCA can look like. But the reality is each school's different. They have to kind of, what's the need in this school? How does it fit? How does FCA fit? And so then we kind of work with the school to make that happen. So we have some groups that meet in the morning before school. Like, there's just the reality is that's the best time for them to meet. So they'll meet in a classroom or somewhere from 7 to 7:30, and class starts after that. Or some schools are a little later, so it's from 7:45 to 8:15. And so it's just the before school, kids are able to gather, and which is what we call a huddle. We have other groups that meet during lunch, because the way the schedule works is that they have a lunch period where kids are able to go and do a club type thing. And so, again, we'll meet in a classroom or whatever. So it just kind of depends on the group. And then we have some schools that right now it's really tough for us to have a time for them to meet on campus. One of the biggest things in FCA's world is we try to do is we try not to we're dealing with athletes. Their schedules are super busy. Right. And so we're trying not to add something to their schedule. So we're trying to go to where they're already at and try to engage with them there. Mm-hmm. And so whether that's at school, before school, but even still, we're starting to see a growth in our team huddles as well, which is, we may have somebody in their meeting, it's just the football team, or this past winter, it's just a basketball team, and they just met after practice on Mondays. Mm-hmm. And so their huddle was just for some of their players on their team. And so we're seeing some traction there too. It just kind of depends on the school setting and kind of what's already going in the school. Because, we have a couple of schools that have a Fellowship of Christian Students, and that's right. different than FCA. But they already have that going, so we don't really necessarily have a fit there right now because they don't need us. They have a great group that's meeting, so we don't need to come in and, sometimes we'll just come in and offer partnerships and things like that, but we don't need to come in and start doing something that they already have going. So it just depends on the school.
So with Gus Macker coming in, proceeds from that go to FCA? Is that how that works?
That's correct. So right now for us, everything we do, we raise locally as far as our ministry expenses. And so right now, a lot of our fundraising is done through churches and through family partnerships. And so that is probably 80% of our funding right now. And so we're just now getting to the point to where we feel like we've never done a fundraiser. We've never done a banquet or a 5K or a golf outing. We've never done those things. And while those things are good, and that's awesome that groups do that, for us, it's just never been a fit. To spend a lot of time and energy on something that just raises funds has really been a struggle for us. And so for this, it felt like, wait a second, this raises funds and that's good, but it actually allows us to do the ministry that we desire to do, which is engage kids in the street, educate parents on what FCA is. And so it really isn't just doing a fundraiser. This is really about, I jokingly told Tom, I said, Tom, if we make zero money on this and only break even, that's still a win. However, we would love to actually utilize this as a fundraiser because we're starting to get to a point. You asked how many schools we have FCA in. We get contacted weekly right now with how do we get FCA involved in this. FCA, what we can do. I had a conversation for a half hour yesterday with a lady who wanted to try to do a Special Olympics style camp in the summer, a sports camp, which is something we do in FCA's world. I don't do that here locally because we just don't have the capacity for that yet.
Right.
And so there's other schools that are desiring for us to have ministry there, but we're limited right now because right now the only staff people are myself and my wife in all of Southern Ohio, which is like 14 or 17 counties, depending on how you count. And so anyway, so we're trying to, we have to take the next step. And for us to take a next step as a ministry to serve the needs that were being presented to us, is doing something that's a fundraiser that then allows us to kind of go to the next level of hiring more staff and gaining more resources and stuff like that.
I was listening to an interview coming in this morning, and it was talking about young people and the despair that so many young people have in our world today, not just in this country, but worldwide. And the program host was talking about, I had my issues when I was a kid, but I don't see the issues that his children had to grow up with currently. And there's obviously a tremendous need for that faith component in our lives. And when we don't have it, there's despair and hopelessness. Yeah. And I know that's part of what you're trying to bring to our young people.
It really is. So we live in a life right now with FCA, and we're going to try to lace this in as much as we can to Gus Macker, is our core values of integrity, service, teamwork, and excellence. And those are all great things. And that's how we want to operate as a ministry. That's how we want to operate Gus Macker. But the reality is like the real root, none of that actually matters if we're missing the giant whole of Jesus. Yeah. And so for us, like, we are seeing that, you know, I'm seeing faces, which is not good, but seeing kids that, man, they're lost. Yeah. They're broken. And right now they look at their screens to try to find answers.
Right.
Or they look at their peers, but most of the time, honestly, it's their screen, and they're trying to find answers, and they're finding answers, but it's just still leaving them empty, and it's leaving them hopeless and lost or more confused. And so we're just trying as best we can is, okay, we set the stage, we give them a space, whether it's a huddle, whether it's a Fields of Faith event that we do, whatever that is, we just try to introduce them to Jesus, because we know that ultimately, once they have that answer, then they can lead a life of integrity, be a great teammate, be servant-hearted, obviously do things with excellence, and they can thrive in those things. But it's just going to fail if they don't have Jesus at the center of that, and if that's not the core of it. So anyway.
And Tom, I know from your experience, not only in faith in business, but faith in your community with your family, you see that this really does work. This just isn't a, throw it in the air and let's see what happens. It works.
Well, Mike, you're so right, and I just have a few more years even on you. But it's in reflection. It's incredible when you can reflect and see how important it is, that foundation. Brian, you articulated all that so well. If we can get to these kids and we can stop that slippery slope from despair to hopelessness, which is the end, and we can turn that around and catch it early enough to get to these kids to, as soon as we identify some of that despair and what are the sources of that, and what are the alternatives to turning that around, and we can get them to understand that, because it's not that we fail, because, for 20, 30 years at Accurate, I didn't fail. But there were many times where I wanted to throw in a towel, and I thought I was a failure, and I was going to fail, literally. But then when I see that, I need God for all of this. Not only did God get me where we're at by bringing the people and who are, but then moving forward now, I can't imagine getting through this world without, as crazy as. So I look in the eyes of the kids. And they got to be so confused. Yeah. And
it's heartbreaking.
So to your point, Mike, it's partly in us being able to look in reflection and say, you know what, I'm grateful that I got through this, but now it's God that's going to get me through this, because I can't imagine even for the rest of my life getting through it without. But He gives us the freedom of choice. Right. He's always there. Yeah. But He doesn't force it on us.
For so many years, and I was, of course, Tom's old enough to remember the 60s, the early 70s. You don't trust anybody over age 30. Of course, the people that said that are in their 80s. But if young people can see that the older generation have not only been sustained but are thriving with what we're talking about, it's like, there is something to this thing, that it's the long haul. It's not just a fad. It's not just here today and gone tomorrow. Yeah. And so there is a connection that we in our older years can even have on young people. And sometimes I think the enemy wants us to believe, they're not going to listen to you. Right. Exactly. Think again. Think again. To wrap up, Brian, we said May 12th is the deadline. Yes. Give us information on how people can get more information.
Yeah, so just go to Macker.com is the easiest way, and then on their website, you click on the city of Chillicothe, and that'll take you right to the registration link that you can register your team. And we need, obviously, teams to register. And then you can also, we have a Facebook page, a local Chillicothe Gus Macker Facebook page, which I have personally been answering a lot of questions on, which has been fantastic. Just people responding and trying to get more information. And so that's been really good. So you can check out more information there between the posts and the comments and stuff. There's a good way to get educated on a lot of questions.
Again, our guest today on special edition of Litter Media Live has been Brian Grigsby of Fellowship of Christian Athletes, and one of their great sponsors, Tom White of Accurate Heating, Cooling, and Plumbing. Our sponsor on our interview today has been Litter Quality Propane. I'm Mike Smith.